Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and a delight to be here. A busy day and a half, but it's a long time since I've remembered such a stimulating and very friendly context for ideas. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful. As a side part, I've been delighted to meet the first person I've known who's in our family's book of records. And I was delighted today to meet the world record holder of rolling pin throwing, who's a member of your wonderful community. So that was a special side benefit for me, but it's a real delight to be here. Some years ago, I was speaking at Stanford University, and a student asked me a question that I'd never been asked before. If you could be a member of any generation except your own, which would you choose? I wasn't quite sure where the questioner was coming from, and all sorts of fancy answers flashed through my mind. Being born in China, I knew some of the great ages and dynasties of China. I'm a great admirer of the Athens of Pericles, or the Rome of Hadrian and Trajan. And of course, I love the England of the two Williams, William Pitt and William Wilberforce, and of course, the founding generation of your own country. They all flashed through my mind. But the answer that came to me was your generation. Because the younger generation, those of you who are students now rising to adulthood, you are described as the crunch generation. A word first used because in the global era, for the first time in history, many of the great questions of humanity are converging. Environmental, economic, demographic, nuclear, technological, various things, raising issues for humanity which will need to be answered in this coming generation if humanity is to go forward with calm sailing. But if they're not answered, or answered badly, humanity will face enormous challenges. But we not only see the crunch generation in terms of global affairs, you can see the same is true domestically in terms of the United States. Many of the great founding principles which made this country what it was have been called into question in the last 50 years and are now increasingly hollow. So America is becoming what put popularly as a cut flower civilization, or put more technically would be it's facing a crisis of cultural authority. And this generation's answers to that will be critical to the future of the United States, the crunch generation. One of the deepest issues is one which sounds abstract and which not many people are addressing, but it actually underlies many of the other issues. How do we live with our deepest differences, especially when those differences are ideological and religious? And you can see that issue underlies so many of the others, and without solving that one constructively, humanity will be facing controversy after controversy, conflict after conflict. I want to set out a vision tonight, which is a minority vision, and ask that you wrestle with these great issues. And I'm afraid I'm going to argue that although America in 230-odd years has achieved the most nearly perfect situation in world history on these issues, the last 50 years of culture warring are taking America to the place where this great country is in danger of squandering its enormous heritage. But let me set out before you a number of propositions, all of which are far too brief, but at least raise discussions that as citizens you need to wrestle with. And as was introduced, I'm an outsider. What does an Englishman know about America? But I'm a great admirer of this country and look at it today with great admiration, but also with profound concern. First, consider why this issue is so explosive and urgent. Three simple factors. We are seeing a global explosion of diversity. It's now said that everyone is now everywhere. The effect of travel, the effect of the media, and the effect of communications, above all the internet, you can see there has never been such a global awareness and such a sense of interconnectivity. And at the same time, in contrast to what was understood of the secularization theory, which put simply was the idea the more modern the world gets, the less religious it gets, what we see is that that was fatally wrong, and we're in a world with an explosive resurgence of religion, but countered this time by a highly aggressive response from secularists. Put that together, and you can see that that problem of living with differences between religions, between ideologies, is extraordinarily potent in today's world. The second factor is that we're seeing many of the traditional settlements of handling these issues floundering. Now, of course, over the centuries, the settlements have differed. But many of our Western nations have settlements that have been largely the same, at least since the 17th and 18th century. You could just take three of the most important: the French, the English, and the American. The French came out of the French Revolution. What you had there was a corrupt state and an oppressive state with, sadly, a corrupt church and an oppressive church. And the two of them in collusion were so oppressive that the revolution threw off both. And the cry of the Jacobin radicals, which came from the Encyclopedias Diderot, was, we must strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. Gory, obviously rather disastrous for the Bourbons, but you can see what that left the French as a settlement. If you were in favor of faith, you were automatically reactionary. If you were in favor of freedom, you were automatically secularist. And so you can see what's called laïcité in France, a very strict separation, has been there ever since the revolution, and today, with the explosion, say, of the Muslim immigrants, that position of laïcité butting heads almost daily with things like the Muslim headscarves. And the French system is under extraordinary pressure. England, as so often, was the middle way. There was a state church, but with no blood on its hands. There was no St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, for example. There was no militant, anti-clerical hostility, but it was a state church. And since 1688 and that establishment, it slowly faded away, so the cynics say today that the Church of England is fit only, as they put it, for the hatching, matching, and dispatching of citizens. In other words, baptize them, marry them, and bury them, and that's all it does. Now, it does a lot more than that, but you can see the Church of England today culturally and theologically weakened in the face of a strident secularism and a mounting Islam. And many people say in 25 years, the establishment will have gone. Your position, of course, by European standards, was then considered the other extreme. And as you know, the First Amendment, the first 16 words, are the most radical and the most audacious part of the American experiment. Religion, disestablished. But faith flourishes not despite disestablishment, but because of it. It's now voluntary as a matter of freedom of conscience, and faith, as Tocqueville and many observers say, has flourished in this country as in no other modern country. But clearly, even today, the growing diversity of the country, the mounting secularism in certain areas of society, and even what was understood of the American way is changing. So, for example, the separation of church and state was put in place in the beginning. And the fundamentalists who deny that simply don't know their history. But of course, the separation of church and state then was not the French style. There was no separation of faith and public life. Until in the 1940s, in came, through the Everson case, a strict separation or what's known as separationism, way beyond Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the strictest separation of his time, but very different from today's strict separation. So every Sunday Jefferson was president. He was present in the largest church service in America, which was under the roof of the Capitol. And he invited Baptists and Episcopalians to have even communion in government buildings such as the White House and the Treasury. There was no strict separation until the Everson case, which set up much of the culture warring over religion and public life. And you can see 50 years of culture warring have brought the American settlement into a place where it's being called in question today. The third factor creating the urgency is the emergence of a global public square. Now, obviously, we as Westerners have prized the notion of a public square going back to the Greeks and Athens and the agora. And many of you have seen the Acropolis and down below the agora. Many people say the marketplace. No. There was a marketplace in Athens, but the public square was primarily not a place for buying and selling. It was a place where citizens came together to discuss the common issues of their common public life, the public square, a physical place. Later for the Romans, a forum. For the English, Westminster. For the French, the Assemblée. Here in the United States, Capitol Hill and the United States Congress. In other words, the public square was once only a physical place. But then over time, it became also a metaphor. Wherever citizens came together to discuss issues of common public life, it could be called a public square, a town meeting, the op-ed pages of a newspaper, or a radio program. They were also, metaphorically, the public square. But we're beyond that now, because the public square has gone virtual, from the physical to the metaphorical to the virtual. And if you think very simply, in the last 15, 20 years, the responses to Salman Rushdie's novel, Satanic Verses, or to the Danish cartoon controversies, or to the Pope's speech, Pope Benedict's speech at the University of Regensburg. What you see is very simple, and you know it daily. Today, we may not be addressing the world, but we can be heard by the world. And the world can organize its response, even a violent response. Now, this is the rudiments of a very real but highly rudimentary global public square. And clearly, it is not promising. You take even the effects of the social media in this country. For example, among many effects, you take the way screen names become anonymous on blogs, and you immediately descend to a very humanly degrading kind of discourse. And you can see that in the age of the internet, the notion of the public square, where we're discussing issues of common public life, is reaching new levels of incivility in the West, which spell very serious concerns for Western democracy and particularly for the American Republic. So this is an urgent issue. How do we live with deep differences when we see this explosion, when we see the settlements floundering and a global public square emerging so far rather threateningly? Secondly, think through why freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief is so primary and so urgent. Again, 3 factors for you to consider. Religious freedom, to use the one word, is the first freedom as the framers understood it. Now, that wouldn't be so in much American discussion today. Even the present administration for 2 years spoke of freedom of worship, which is a very narrow, shrunk form of what's understood traditionally of freedom of conscience. Every dictator in history guarantees freedom of worship. What you are thinking between your 2 ears, so long as you keep your mouth shut, that's freedom of worship. And the Chinese guarantee that, and every dictator does. That is not religious freedom. And for the administration to speak like that was a matter of extraordinary, willful ignorance. But why did the framers consider freedom of conscience primary? Religious freedom was never just freedom for the religious. The Universal Declaration and the European discussion talks about, as I said, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. Specifically the last word because it includes all those who support a naturalistic worldview, such as atheists and agnostics. They too are guaranteed freedom of conscience. But why was it primary? Well, just take the first of the three political rights in the First Amendment: freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. There is no hierarchy, but if you think about them, they are interlocking and interdependent. And it's clear that freedom of assembly, the right to get together with people you want to get together with, assumes and requires freedom of speech. You're not there to have a kumbaya hug-in moment. You want to say something to people that you care about. But by the same token, freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. You're quite free to talk about the weather. My country changes every 10 minutes. It's something worth talking about. Not in many places of the world. Freedom of conscience means you're free to speak about the things of which you're convinced as true and just and human because of that inner forum of conscience which leaves you bound by the dictates of conscience. And as it was understood, the conscience is an internal forum for free people, just as the public square is an external forum for free people. In other words, we look at life, each of us, and based on the dictates of conscience, we come to those convictions that we believe are true and right and good and wise and human. Here I stand, so help me God, as Martin Luther said, I can do no other. So freedom of conscience, if you think it through, was, as the framers rightly said, the first liberty. Now today I've heard it argued in Washington that freedom of conscience is like the appendix. We're given appendixes, but we don't need them. You can live without them. And so they say you can cut out the first 16 words of the First Amendment and still be fine. No. Freedom of conscience is primary and fundamental. The second reason it's important is more practical. It is one of the keys to a civil society. As you know, in the last 20 years, an enormous discussion with leading scholars talking about what a civil society is. The discussion goes back to Tocqueville and many others. In other words, a society is healthy in terms of social capital if between all the individual citizens and the government at the top, you have a thick layering of voluntary organizations in which people can join, sign up, volunteer, give money, and pursue their dreams in various areas with freedom. Now that, of course, assumes that they have freedom of conscience, religious freedom, in order to pursue those dreams, whether they're charitable or reforming or educational or whatever. And the American experiment itself shows that, for example, many people think that the entrepreneurial spirit in America came through capitalism. No, it came through the First Amendment. When the culture shifted from a politics of coercion, European style, to a politics of persuasion, American style, and it was rooted in freedom of conscience, people had the freedom to pursue these things, and the first half of the 19th century saw an explosion of things that we now call civil society. If you think for a minute, in other words, in the current things, the healthcare mandates. By crippling the Catholic Church at a point of conscience, whether it was orphanages or health care, the administration was in effect killing the goose that laid the golden egg. No community in all human history, I'm not a Catholic, but all human history, no community has done more for health care than the Catholic Church, founding more hospitals and so on. It's the Christian community at large. No one's rivaled it in any other civilization. But by crossing conscience, as the administration did, without even consulting, they're killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And sadly, that's continuing in other areas. The third reason this is important is that freedom of conscience is the key to social harmony. I was born in China, as said. I go back there every 2 or 3 years. And many times in universities or the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, I hear Chinese scholars saying, well, of course, we are the harmonious society. Hu Jintao's favorite way of putting it. And I say to them bluntly, no big deal. What China has is remarkable diversity and remarkable harmony, but they miss the one thing that matters, liberty. America at its best has had the diversity with liberty and still achieved harmony. Now, to do that, which is the real challenge of our world in an age of exploding diversity, we need to know how we live with deep differences so that freedom of conscience and thought and religion and so on is really understood by people of all faiths and how to negotiate it. Let me move on, thirdly, to raise the question of some of the weaknesses and the mistakes in the more recent American discussion of these issues. Some of these are mistakes by conservatives, some of these are mistakes by liberals. But profound mistakes are being made which are undercutting the great heritage that you have in this country. The first mistake has been to reduce the controversies to law. If you read the great thinkers of the past, say Montesquieu, or his disciple Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, Montesquieu argues that freedom is guaranteed, on the one hand, by the structures of freedom. That's the Constitution, that's the law, the structures of freedom. But that by itself will never be enough. It also has to be guaranteed by the spirit of liberty, which is in the hearts of the citizenry. The structures you can lay down and they can last for generations, even if you neglect them. But the spirit of liberty has to go from generation to generation to generation, or in any generation, it can die out. Tocqueville argues, as Montesquieu's disciple, that America has the law in a magnificent way, but also has the habits of the heart. Now, character is the habit of the heart. It was understood that in free societies, everybody's born free, not everyone's up to it. They have to be taught how to be a free, responsible citizen. In other words, in the families, in the schools, and in the faith communities, the habits of the heart of freedom were laid down and passed down from generation. But if you look at the 50 years we've had of culture warring, it is now all law and litigation. And of course, if you cover the country with laws, you have less freedom. But more importantly, in terms of my argument, you put no weight on the habits of the heart, and you lose the spirit of freedom, and everything becomes litigious. When I was involved in the Williamsburg Charter in the mid-'80s, I was talking to one of the leaders of the ACLU, and he said to me with a smile, there's a simple reason we will always win in the culture wars. We have more lawyers than anyone else. They did then. But if you look today, you have batteries of liberal lawyers with huge defense funds and mounting numbers of litigation, countered by batteries of conservative lawyers with equally huge defense funds and mounting litigation, and America's embroiled in controversy after controversy. And the simple fact is, when you come to the issues of freedom and the habits of the heart, law, which is a precious protection, is too blunt to solve many of the issues that really solved. And an ounce of civility can go a lot further than a ton of law. And yet Americans today rely on law and litigation and are losing freedom by losing the habits of the heart. A second common mistake is that groups and individuals fight for their own rights at the expense of caring for the common good. I said to groups today that the Greeks talked about the fact there were 3 options. Greeks could be tribespeople, or as they put it, idiots, or citizens. What did they mean? Tribespeople could only think in terms of groups and voted in lockstep with their group. Idiots was the Greek word, not for a nutcase, but for someone who had a purely private perspective on everything and didn't care for the common good. The citizen had his own interests clearly, but also cared for the common good of Athens, or what the Puritans would have called the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, or whatever. But you see today, in a highly individualistic situation, there's hardly any talk about the common good and everyone else's interest. Sometimes this self-interest is protective. Christians should be ashamed not to care about the common good. But many of the Christian voices in public only argue for their own rights. Now, the simple fact is, as you can see from history, in the past, Christians have fought for the rights of others, the neighbor. And in fact, practically, Christian rights are best guaranteed when everybody else's rights are guaranteed. The Jew, the atheist, the Muslim, the Mormon, or whatever. And always the test of religious freedom is whether society guarantees the rights to the minority and to the least popular community. And when the tiniest minority or the least popular community knows that their rights are protected, then everyone's rights are in good standing. And so for Christians or conservatives to make the mistake of fighting only for me, my, and our is fundamentally counterproductive. The same thing is done by many on the other side too. So you can see, for example, some of the extremes, I stress the word extreme here, some of the extreme gay activists. Many of the gay activists had a much more public-spirited view of religious freedom. But some of the worst of them, and one of them is in the White House, they see the promotion of their rights as a zero-sum game. Wherever they're countered and denied, they must overrule everyone else's, including, they say, trumping the religious freedom of other people. The net effect is they're undermining all human rights by saying that rights which are inherent in humanity can be trumped in the name of their right just because of power. And you can see today that whether it's Christians trying to protect their rights for themselves or the extreme gay activists trying to promote their rights for themselves, both have forgotten the common good, and the net effect is destructive. The third common mistake being made today is that people are trying to counter the negative with the negative. Take notions like hate crime. The trouble of putting hate, of course, is subjective. Who's to say? God only knows the motives of our hearts. But as soon as you use something like that, that's in the eye of the beholder, you're putting a sword in the hand of the power wielder. Or take a notion like the current discussion of phobiaization. In other words, the tactic when someone disagrees with you, you can say they're a phobe of some sort, an Islamophobe, a homophobe, or now Christians are called to talk about Christophobes. What happens? Well, you're having discussion, maybe deep, important differences, but rather than respect each other's differences, by using one of the phobiaization tactics, you're just closing off debate and undercutting civility and the Republican discourse that we need to have a thriving society. Far better, as the history of anti-Semitism shows, is to counter the negative with the positive. To teach what it means, not toleration. The old word toleration is not a good word. Toleration is better than the opposite, intolerance. But tolerance is built on the power equation. The strong tolerate the weak. The majority tolerate the minority. The government tolerates the citizen. That is not human rights. Human rights are inherent in a person being a human being, and the government's task is not to grant human rights, but to guard them. To guard them. And yet you see today that that's being cheerfully undermined by so many with these negative tactics. Anti-Semitism is best answered by positive notions, and the same is true of the violations of religious freedom. Not calling on phobiaization or hate crimes or whatever, but teaching people how we live with deep differences and what it means to respect people's rights to this and to know how to differ with them civilly and peacefully and persuasively. Now we move on, fourthly, to the heart of the discussion. It's not enough to have academic analyses. We've got academic studies coming out of our ears. It's not enough merely to monitor the violations, and there are obviously huge violations in today's world. What the world needs is a solution, a constructive way forward. Now, if you look at religious liberty around the world, clearly there are two models that are dominant and powerful. I would say, you make up your own minds, I would say two extremes. And I want to argue for a new position in the middle, which is being advocated more and more, but which is quite clearly not as powerful as the other two, because it's new. Much of the discussion today is between the advocates of what's called a sacred public square and the advocates of what's called a naked public square. A sacred public square is where public life is dominated by some preferred or established religion. Now, there are very mild versions of that. I mentioned the Church of England. It's about as mild as you can get. But it's still an established church where people who are not Anglican, whether they're Catholic or atheist or whatever, are inevitably second class. You have very strong and severe versions of that. Take, say, Iran or Saudi Arabia, a sacred public square. Clearly, under the conditions of a sacred public square, all those who do not share the preferred or established faith are second class at best, and at worst, in certain countries, they lose their lives. That is not the way of justice and freedom for everyone. But at the other extreme, you have what Richard John Newhouse called the naked public square, where there's an attempt to exclude all religions from public life. Now, of course, that has the effect of smuggling in the secularists who pretend they're not one of those. But the point is, most of the world, more than 80%, most of the world is openly religious in one way or another. And you can see that to exclude religious voices from the public square is highly illiberal. Now, that is the direction, say, of the strict separationists here, or some of the stronger secularist voices. I personally, as a Christian, thank God for atheist thinkers like Jürgen Habermas, maybe the most famous atheist in Europe at the moment. But he argues quite openly, for liberals to exclude any religious voice in the public square is highly illiberal. And the naked public square is as wrong as the sacred public square in the extremes. But of course, again, you have mild and you have severe versions. The American version of strict separation is relatively mild. The French is a lot stronger. But when you move up to China and North Korea, you have very severe notions, and people who don't share the regime's ideology are in danger with their lives. And quite clearly, while people like Christopher Hitchens talk about how religion poisons everything, a simple factual account of the 20th century shows that more people died under secularist regimes led by secularist leaders with a secularist ideology than all the religious persecutions in Western history combined. The Chinese record, for instance, under Mao Zedong, probably up to 75 million Chinese killed in the name of that ideology. And I would argue that both the sacred public square and the naked public square are not the way forward, because they do not do justice to the freedom of conscience of everyone. What's the third position I mentioned? It's what's called not a sacred public square or a naked public square, but a civil public square. What does that mean? It's a notion of public life where everybody of every faith, sometimes called a non-faith, but they're a faith too, the so-called religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, everybody is free to enter public life and engage public life on the basis of their faith. That's freedom of conscience. But within a politically agreed framework of what is right for everybody else too. So a right for a Christian is a right for an atheist, and a right for a Jew, and a right for a Mormon, and a right for every believer of every position under the sun. A right for one is a right for another and a responsibility for both. Now, of course, a lot of things are implied in that. For example, you shift from coercion to persuasion. If in the public square you want your views to prevail, you have to enter and engage and argue for them persuasively. Christians, for example, made the great mistake entering the public square and saying, "The Bible says, therefore," when many people in the public square don't accept the Bible, read the Bible, or know it as their authority. So just as the Apostle Paul spoke one way in the synagogue and differently on Mars Hill, so Christians should know how to be more persuasive to people of all different backgrounds when they enter the public square. Now, civility has become a wimp word today, a very weak word, and it needs to be clarified in what terms of what it is. Civility is the classical word for the virtue and the duty of citizens in a diverse society who know how to deal with other people of very different backgrounds peacefully and persuasively, not coercively and violently. Civility is not niceness. One used to be able to say before the last 10 years, civility is not tea party etiquette, but the tea party means something else today. Civility is not table manners. It is a virtue and a duty. But more importantly for people of faith, civility is not a search for a lowest common denominator. There are people, say Karen Armstrong, who's calling for a worldwide search for that unity below all the faiths, and when we find that, we'll all happily agree. That's a myth. The simple fact is the differences between our faiths are ultimate and irreducible at the level of their premises. An Orthodox Jew and an atheist are living in two completely different universes. A Christian has profound disagreements with the worldview of the Hindu and vice versa. At the level of our assumptions and the deepest premises, the differences are irreducible and ultimate. And as you know, if you think, the differences make a difference. And they make a difference not just for individuals who live that way, but for entire societies who espouse that worldview. Differences matter. But civility is rather a framework in which each faith is free to be itself, but knows how to differ with others, and if they want to prevail in public life, to know how to persuade others that their position on whatever it is the correct one. But public life is not the place where we argue the differences between the faiths. That's much better in the private world. Public life is where we come together to discuss the issues of our common public life. Obviously, it's the implications of our different faiths lived out in public, but that's rather different from the argument, say, between Christians or Muslims or whatever. We're arguing the implications of that for our community life together. My own picture of this is the Queensberry rules in boxing. If any of you are sports aficionados, you probably know that the Romans, who of course loved their gladiatorial games, in which hundreds of thousands of humans and millions of animals died, the Romans thought boxing was too brutal, and they banned it, which is odd. But it was brutal. If you look at the Colorado bare-knuckle fights or 19th century London fights, they were brutal. Sometimes 100 rounds over a huge heath, and one or other of the boxers died at the end of it. To make it better, the Marquis of Queensberry lent his name to the new rules, and boxing was put in a ring, and it had rules, and it was under a referee. Now, they touch gloves at the beginning, and as you know, they don't punch below the belt. They don't want to be disqualified, but they still compete. And there are winners and losers. And that's, of course, democracy. The Democrats are in power now. The Republicans don't take to the streets with tanks. They make sure that next time they want to be in, and so on and so on. There will always be winners and losers in democracy. The 51% has the word for the moment. But here's the point. A civil public square gives the ground rules, as you have the Queensberry rules in boxing, but there's still competition. Christians sometimes complain about the public life and what's happening, and if they don't engage themselves, they get the effects they deserve. And you can see that that's true of all of us. But there's a third misunderstanding, and that is that civility is a matter of tolerant indifference. We recognize their differences, we're called to celebrate their differences, we're called to accept their differences, and so on. So we just shrug our shoulders like the French or the teenagers, whatever. That is not civility. The better way I'd put it like this: the right to believe anything does not mean that anything anyone believes is right. The first half of that sentence, the right to believe anything, that's freedom of conscience. There is no limit to a person's right to believe what they believe in terms of belief before the law, and I would say also before God. The right to believe based on the dictates of conscience is absolute. The Constitution has always recognized that. But that doesn't mean that anything anyone believes is right, especially when they make arguments for how we should all be affected in the public square. And when we differ, we respect their right to believe what they believe, but we have a right to and a responsibility to try and out-argue them through prevailing persuasion. So civility itself needs to be recovered in terms of the strength of what it is as a virtue and as a duty. One last point. How does this sort of a vision, or any advance in human rights, how does it spread? Well, we can look at all the history of human rights, often traced back to Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. So next year will be the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. But then the English Bill of Rights, and then the Virginia Declaration, and then the Declaration of Independence, and then the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, and 5 days later, the French rights of man and citizen, and of course the Supreme Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can trace this great tradition, far from perfect, but very powerful in its shaping of justice in our world. But as you look at it, there are 3 stages that need to go through if it's to have any effect. Stage 1, declaration. Declaration. Whether you're looking at the Declaration of Independence or the Universal Declaration, they are only a declaration of principle. When the Universal Declaration passed in December the 6th, 1948, there was nothing legally binding. They would have argued for years more if they'd gone for that. It was a declaration of principle which was there like a beacon to the world over against the Nazi atrocities and some of the dangers of imperialism and empire and so on. Here was a declaration. You start there. Now, you've got a lot of good declarations in American history. The second stage was always implementation, and that was putting the declaration and its principles into law. For many countries in the world, that took 15, 20, 25 years later. And now, most of the countries of the world have many of those principles in their laws, if not in their founding constitution. But that is not enough. The third stage is the vital one, transmission and education. That's what creates the habits of the heart. That's America's problem today. It's all laws. And you're losing the spirit of freedom in this area. Europe has the problem in spades. Interestingly, the world now copies European laws rather than American laws. Europe is thick with laws, articles, conventions, laws for this, that, and the other. There's no habits of the heart. So the gap between European laws and what happens on the ground is extreme. And you get all sorts of bizarre contradictions from it, and Europe simply has no real understanding of religious freedom in practice. You've done far, far better, although, as I said, you're in danger of throwing it away. Now, that education and transmission, that cultivation of the habits of the heart, is the business of the family, is the business of the faith community, and the business of the schools. And sadly, here in the US, clearly all of those in different ways are not doing the job they once did. But you need to cultivate the spirit of liberty, the habits of the heart, if freedom is really to be strong. And that third stage is the one that's profoundly missing today. Now, I'm not Pollyanna. There is no one settlement for all countries. There's no one size fits all. Every country has its own history and its own values. But I would argue they need to build into the core of whatever that history is, whatever those values are, they need to build in the core of the fundamental protections of freedom of conscience, the rights of thought, conscience, religion, and belief for all their citizens. Now again, I'm not a Pollyanna. We look at our world. Clearly, America is greatly in advance of the rest of the world. I would say with certain pride, but a great deal of sadness, most of your great ideas in this area came from Englishmen. For example, Roger Williams and his great notion of soul freedom. But those ideas never flourished in England. They flourished here. He was the founder of Rhode Island and so on. Put differently, Europe has many of those first principles in its history. And it has the challenges now to think through what those principles are under the challenging conditions of modern diversity. But at the moment, Europe is floundering. So you have America, which had the most nearly perfect system, even with the blind spots. I know the violations, nativism, Philadelphia riots in the 1830s, you name it. You've had your blind spots, but compared with most of history, you've achieved the most nearly perfect system. James Madison called it the true remedy for religion and public life. So you've got it there, but you're throwing it away. And the irony is that while, say, Seymour Martin Lipset, the great historian, argued that America was the first new nation, what he meant was that under the conditions of the rise of modernity, America bravely tackled many of the issues of modernity first in the world. But when the framers talked about city on a hill and all that sort of stuff, the rest of the world wasn't interested. They were still happily going on in their traditional ways. But now the whole world is beginning to face the problems of modernity, like America did 200 years ago. And instead of looking at America and being able to learn, often you say, well, America has the seeds of so many lessons for us, and they look across, and what they see is the culture warring and America squandering her great heritage. You should, by all rights, take the lead in showing a way forward for the world. Whether you will, I don't know. Europe is a long way behind, but the challenges are so great, some European statesmen are grappling as your early founders began to do. Of course, other parts of the world, take the Middle East, the titanic cataclysmic convulsions, or take China with its brutal oppression and so on. It'll be a long time before any notion of religious freedom for all comes to parts of the Middle East or to China. I'm not a Pollyanna. Tocqueville, and I love this, Tocqueville, as you know, who wrote Democracy in America, and Americans love him because he praised democracy in America. But he also had many misgivings. And if you read the second volume, he's not quite so sanguine as he was in the first. But more importantly, he always compared the American Revolution to the French Revolution. And he was openly a disappointed lover of his own country's revolution. But after a lifetime of comparing them in many ways, he made a wonderful little remark towards the end of his life. With a revolution, as with a novel, the hard part to invent is the ending. No country has had so many great men all in one generation. You think of Athens and Pericles, but there was no one like him. I think in my lifetime I met him as a boy, Winston Churchill, but there was no one like him. But you had a whole generation of great men in all sorts. They had their blind spots. But the danger of many intellectuals today is because of those blind spots, the treatment of slaves and so on, the framers have thrown out baby bathwater and all without recognizing the areas where they got it nearly right from the very beginning. You had a great beginning for all the blind spots. And you've had many great chapters in your story since then. But if this is right, and this is only one area today, we could discuss other areas if we had more time. If this is right, the rising generation, the crunch generation, has come to the place where many of America's best ideas and convictions are increasingly either hollow or contested. And if they're not restored in a deep and profound way in the context of our modern setting, quite clearly the Republic will decline. And that's why those of you who are students, rising to your adult responsibility, you are the crunch generation, and the chapter you write will be immensely significant for the future of this country. Thank you.
I'm the 1995 Iowa Teacher of the Year, and I've taught school in Russia, the Czech Republic, the Ukraine, Guam, and Taiwan, and all across the United States. And the one thing I do before I teach anything, any of the classes, I ask every kid in the class, do you know what I see when I see you? And no matter where I've been in the world, I get the same response, utter stunned silence. So I tell them what I see. I see the most precious thing on the planet Earth. That's the way you should see yourself, because if you do, you won't do anything dumb or stupid to harm the most precious thing on the planet Earth. See all the people around you? They see the same thing, so now you know how to treat them. We've never done that in the history of mankind on this planet, and it drives me crazy. And if you still don't understand why you're the most precious thing on the planet Earth, just remember this is the only place in this big universe we know for sure there's life. That does make it precious. Do you have any feedback, comments? Is that a good idea, bad idea?
It's a wonderful way of starting. But of course the challenge is, as you say, we look at each other, we're looking at human beings. And you take, say, C.S. Lewis's essay, The Weight of Glory, and all that he put in that, we're looking at each other as potentially immortal beings and so on. But the question today is, why? Because in our postmodern world, where there is no truth and everything's the will to power, why is that other precious? Why do they have inalienable dignity? And many of the current ideas cannot answer that. So I agree with you, that's a wonderful way of putting it, but you're only just beginning the discussion, and the question underlying it is, why? So thank you. Yes, sir.
Are we alternating between
Would you identify yourself?
Oh, okay. My name is Jason Saporta. I'm a
Little louder for me.
My name is Jason Saporta. I'm a graduate student in statistics. And I have a question about, you have mentioned secularist regimes and all the killing that they've done. And I'm wondering, when you look at the official record of Kim Jong-il's birth, or when you look at Cultural Revolution era propaganda posters, you know, with Mao,
Get
Chairman
closer
Mao.
to the microphone, sir.
Sorry.
Kiss that microphone.
When you look at
Yeah, there you go.
when you look at the official story of Kim Jong-il's birth, or when you look at Cultural Revolution era propaganda posters with Chairman Mao looking like a god, everybody holding the little red books, don't these seem to recall kind of religious types of iconography? And is the problem really that these regimes were secularist, or were they too much like religions? And do you really think that Christopher Hitchens didn't dislike these types of regimes at least as much as he disliked religious regimes? Thank you.
For someone like Stalin, you know, statistics definitely came into it. And as he remarked, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of 100 million is a mere statistic. And one of the problems in our world is that the triumph of your world, let me put it bluntly, the 19th century warned against the tyranny of metrics, of numbers, of quantitative ways of measuring everything, because the danger would be you forget that 100 million people is 100 million real faces with sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, children, etc., etc. And we've always got to remember that with our huge numbers, big data, etc., today, we've got individuals there. And so certainly that was behind Stalin. But if you look at ideologically, George Orwell and others pointed out, Arthur Koestler, many, it was because of their ideology. What was the individual, say, over against the collective? Or put another way, human individuality faces in the 20th century 3 great challenges. One was collectivism. The individual compared with the collective, nothing. Or the second was determinism. And the third was reductionism. You just reduce human beings to this. Well, any way you cut it in those 3, the human individual doesn't really matter. So it's incredibly important today to know why every single person, who wouldn't count in statistics, has worth. Precious, inalienable worth. And we've got to fight for that at the heart of our age of great numbers. So I do think there's a link between statistics and Stalin, but also between his secular ideology. You can trace it back very clearly.
I have a question from a 9-year-old. What will be the leading culture, I think maybe worldview, in America in the next 10 years?
A lot of answers when we go to the future. The real answer is only God knows. I'm not a futurist. I think futurism is a quack science. But we can say how the answer will become an answer, and that is which faiths will enter public life, whether it's the media or education or the government, and argue powerfully and persuasively for the ideas that they believe are true and just and human. And I believe strongly in the Christian faith. I'm a follower of Jesus. And I think the Christian faith has a profound answers in terms of human dignity and justice and freedom and so on. But those of us who are followers of Jesus have got to get out there and answer those questions and argue for those positions in ways that have hope of prevailing. So which one will be? I don't know. But I know what it will take to do that. So far, for example, even if you take numerically, a community I have great respect for, the Jewish community. They are 2% of Americans. But knowing the terrible history they had in Europe, pogroms, persecution, death camps, they, when they came to this country, went to the leading centers of this country so that their voices, tiny numerically, could be powerful culturally. And they have an influence out of all proportion to their numbers. And one could say, all power to them. They've done it. And shame on those who are followers of Jesus, who in Jesus' terms have hidden their light under a bushel. It's time to live it, to speak it with truth and love and grace, and hopefully to win some of the arguments, because deep and profound things are at stake. So I don't know the answer. 10 years' time, I have no idea. But I know what it would take for someone to prevail.
Okay, to the mic.
Great question.
Great question, 9-year-old.
I wish I was 9. My name is Sudhanshu Vyas. I'm trying to get my PhD in computer engineering for the past 4.5 years.
Very unclear.
Yeah, talk a little bit closer to the mic.
But
My name is Sudhanshu Vyas. Is that close enough?
That's better.
it's still not very clear, but it's better.
Yeah, just talk a little bit more slowly.
Did everyone get my name?
It's okay. Go ahead.
So my question is that if you want a society in which religions are, whether you have the ability to practice or preach a religion, shouldn't society have religions which are open to other religions' point of view and absorb that part also? For example, if Islam or Hinduism has a point of view which is now relevant for Christianity, should Christianity embrace that part of it and take it in a more scientific or methodical way instead of just saying that this is the way and nothing's going to change about it?
I didn't hear a lot of the words in between. But if I understand it rightly, we're talking about how different faiths relate to each other. We've talked about this evening just the right of freedom of conscience. But of course, apart from the public square, there's a huge amount of public life. Public life is much bigger than the narrow public square where we come to discuss our common matters of living together. The faiths clearly should, in terms of what I said tonight, respect each other's rights to believe what they believe. But then the differences between them will make a difference. I mean, let me be candid. Why do historians of science say that Hinduism never produced modern science? Well, simple answer, its view of reality is that it's Maya. And all the great historians of science point that that worldview didn't give a basis for a real exploration of the universe in the way that the Jewish and Christian worldview did. And you could go on like this.
Well, that's a very interesting point which you brought, that European culture cannot directly translate Hindu vocabulary or Indian vocabulary to their own vocabulary. For example, Maya is imagination, meaning like all the stress that you have in the world is your imagination. Now, coming to science, Schrodinger and Oppenheimer have quoted Vedanta heavily. And I don't remember which of the two, but one of them said that after talking to Hindu monks, quantum mechanics makes sense.
Again, forgive me, we need to discuss afterwards face to face. A lot of the words I lost there. But when Oppenheimer was talking, for example, about the nuclear test in New Mexico, he was talking about Krishna as the great destroyer. He wasn't talking about the way science is rooted in a particular view of the universe. But what I'm saying is, the differences make a huge difference. I've referred several times tonight to human dignity. We could look at freedom. We could look at reality in science. We could look at the notion of purpose, which I raised last night. And the different worldviews are different at very key points, and those differences make a difference. And so you raise the question, always with a clash, competition, comparison of worldviews. I would argue that contrast is the mother of clarity, but we need, with real love and openness to each other, to debate and discuss these things, because they will have very important implications for our culture. My concern is much more actually with, say, British atheists who are now undermining the foundations for human dignity. That is much more of a concern of mine, but I've studied under a guru in Rishikesh, and I've known some of the great thinkers.
Can I ask you a question in Hindi then, because you'd probably know Hindi?
I think we need to go on to another
Okay,
question.
thank you.
I can't hear you, but thank you. I'd love to talk more face to face, but thank you.
I have another question from the computer here. How do you see the virtual being a source of unity rather than division? How do you see the virtual?
Well, in terms of public life at the moment, it isn't. And if you add all the technological factors to what I was saying about incivility, clearly television sound bites are a problem. How could you have the Lincoln-Douglas debates with 15-second sound bites? Discourse suffers. Or you take direct mail. If you take 10 direct mail letters and look what they underline, the words they underline, they almost always appeal to fear or hatred of the other. And the very notion and style of direct mail, whether electronic or written, creates incivility. I was using the most dramatic, which is the anonymous screen names. And whenever you see discussion like that, it quickly descends to something that's horrific in terms of incivility. So we've got to all add that. At the moment, while the internet joins us and has that potential to join us as never before, the effect on politics is the opposite. And almost every new technology has pluses and minuses, assets and costs. And we've got to weigh them up and lean against the worst and use the best. But at the moment, the internet is not working towards unity in terms of the things we're talking about tonight.
Okay, to the mic.
Now, I dread the mic because it's so difficult to hear from up
Yeah.
here what you're saying.
All right, how's it going? My name is David, and I'm a junior in economics. And my question is, even though the United States as a whole is not trending towards being less religious, why do you think
Not
that...
standing for what?
Slow down just a little bit, because it echoes up here.
Okay. Why do you think that even though the United States as a whole is not trending towards being less religious, why do you think that individuals, especially between 18 and 30, like especially in college, are trending towards being less religious in the United States?
again, if I heard you rightly, and forgive me if I didn't, this is such a big country that everything you say is wrong and right. In other words, you'll always find exceptions. So I thank God for every exception. And all over the country, I meet people who are longing and hungering and working towards greater civility. But living in Washington, if any of you are watching Washington, it's not exactly the world capital of civility at the moment. And every 3 years, they ship the congressman up to Hershey in Pennsylvania, and they have a weekend on civility. And then they come back down and go on as they did before. And you can see in many of the leading areas of this country, what I was saying is true. Thank God for every exception. If you're an exception, thank God for you. But I hope I heard you right. It is incredibly difficult to hear.
It is, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One from email. What is your opinion of the American Tea Party?
Oh. Some of you know, who've read my books, I've been a critic of the Christian right for 30 years. Until 1975, most American evangelicals were what's called privatized. They weren't involved in the public life. They had a faith that was called privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. The wake-up year for evangelicals was 1973. You had Watergate, OPEC crisis, and Roe v. Wade. And in 1975, you had the beginning publicly of what became known as the Christian right or the religious right, the founding of moral majority. And that collapsed the Christian coalition. Most people would say, although there's a fair amount of argument over this, that the end of the religious right in really significant power was the Obama's first election in 2008. And then the scattered remnants of that made up a part of the Tea Party movement. But let me mainly focus on the religious right as it was. It made two huge mistakes which have tarnished all Christians. First, it was politicized. It trusted politics to do more than politics can do. That was a fatal mistake. Secondly, though, to use 19th century language, they tried to do the Lord's work, but in the world's way. So the issues they fought were worth fighting. I'm pro-life. But Jesus told his followers to love their enemies. The Christian right many times demonized their enemies, almost always stereotyped their enemies. And you could go on like that. And by doing that, they've created a huge national backlash against Christians in public life. Put it another way, this is the first generation in America where there is no Christian tradition with moral authority in the public square. The low point in church attendance until recently was the late 18th century. Then you had the revival, and for most of the 19th century, the evangelicals were the leading voice in public life, the presidents of many of the universities. But through their anti-intellectualism, they went into the backwoods and became fundamentalists, Scopes trial, etc., etc. From the 1880s to the 1960s, the dominant voice in American public life was the Protestant mainline, with some very distinguished voices. Take, say, Reinhold Niebuhr and people like him. In the 1960s, the Protestant mainline committed suicide. Theologically, notions like God is dead. How can you have theology if you don't believe in God? And some crazy left-wing ideas that led them into the wilderness. They've been out of it ever since then. Presiding bishop, the Episcopal Church, and so on, they have no influence in Washington at all. Since the 60s, you've had a friendly rival between an emerging Catholicism, which in the early 19th century was considered un-American for various reasons, including their views against religious freedom. Now they have a very responsible voice because of their 100 years of the Catholic encyclicals, but sadly, through the sexual abuse crisis, they're discredited nationally. And you had on the other side the evangelicals emerging, born-again movement and so on, but through their excesses and sometimes evils, they've discredited themselves. And so now you have no Christian, our atheist friends here tonight would welcome that. But there is no Christian tradition now with moral authority in the public life. So for me, the Tea Party movement is the scattered embers of the fracturing of the Christian right with some very important conservative principles, such as the resistance to the growth of the state and the fact that liberalism is now becoming illiberal is calling itself progressive and putting its weight in the growth of the state. So the Tea Party is making some very, very important statements in terms of American history, but it doesn't have a cohesive, constructive philosophy, as I think any powerful movement would need to have. That was a very quick summary.
Okay, we'll go to the mic.
Hi, my name is Micaiah Watt, and I'm a sophomore in the art program. I have a lot of questions for you now, but I'll just ask my first one. How do you propose in a civil public square to avoid the problems of pluralism and universalism?
We can't avoid the problem of pluralism. There's a misunderstanding of pluralism. Pluralism is a social fact. It's the simple fact there are a lot of people out there with a whole lot of differences, whether ethnic, linguistic, religious, ideological, whatever. Pluralism is a fact. America's probably never been more diverse than today. My wife comes from Southern California. There's Southern California schools with 90 religions, 90, in one public school. The problem of pluralism is not pluralism, it's a social fact. The problem is relativism. The idea if there are that many, none of them are right, everyone's just relatively right. That's the problem. So universalism comes in as an often, I would think, mushy, syncretistic attempt to bring some common unity. But as I was arguing earlier, there isn't one. When you come down to our beliefs, they are different. And people want the freedom to be faithful to that which they believe, and they don't want to be watered down in some syncretistic mishmash. So pluralism's a fact. The question is, how do you give everyone that right to be free to what they're faithful to, and so on? That's why I was arguing a civil public square gives you the freedom to be yourself, and yet the responsibility to respect others, but to persuade them if you disagree with them, and so on. So a lot of Christians, not in your question, but a lot of Christians are afraid of, they call it the P word, pluralism. It's a fact. The danger is not pluralism, it's relativism.
We need to go on
okay.
to another. Thank you. How can we hope to achieve agreements in the civil public square if the beliefs of some faiths oppose the very being of others? Homosexuality, polygamy, abortion, etc.
As I was arguing earlier, if you picked it up, I think the differences between the faiths, say Christians arguing with Islam or atheists arguing with Judaism, those are best left in private life. The public square is where we discuss issues of our common public life. And that certainly includes the things you mentioned, like form of marriage or life or death through euthanasia, whatever. Those are issues of common public life. But we're not discussing there whether Christianity is right or atheism is right, not in the public square. We're looking at the roots of the differences. We're looking at the results of the differences for our common life. But in the common life, just as I said, the Democrats are in power, the Republicans hope to get in. In other words, 51% in a majority wins. So whoever argues for certain forms of marriage and they win the public argument, that will be the way we go. There's no question. There's profound differences. The challenge comes, and where the gays have gone wrong, they've forgotten that their rights don't trump everyone else's. So the mark of a just society is whether it respects the conscience of the minority. And that's where at the moment some of the extreme gay activists, not some of the more responsible ones, they want to trump everybody's rights. Roger Williams got it right. He was talking about the ship of state, but he made the mark, the problem of religious violations is when those, I'm using his terms, under the hatches, think of slaves in a slave ship, those under the hatches get to the helm. Those two words, under the hatches, at the helm, were his words. And that's what you always see. And he said in the 17th century, where the danger was Presbyterians, Scottish Presbyterians, imposing themselves on everyone in England, He says the new presbyter is the old priest writ large. And you can say today, some of the extreme gay activists are the old priest writ large. Having now gone from under the hatches to the helms, they're treating other people the way they were treated, rather than working out what is freedom for everybody and guaranteeing the rights of those who are not now in the majority. And you can see that's going to be an issue of the next 10 years. Will those who disagree, for example, Catholics over the healthcare mandates, will they just be overruled? Or will their rights be respected through reasonable accommodation, as the lawyers put it?
To the mic.
Hi, my name is Kevin Buchik. I'm an undergrad in computer science. You seem throughout your talk to focus a lot on religious liberty and issues of religious difference. I would ask, do you see these issues of religious difference as the most important social issue facing human civilization in the future, or is there something more fundamental than that we need to resolve other than religion?
Obviously, in the past, other differences like, say, nationalism. This is the 100th anniversary of the First World War. That was a disaster bred on nationalism, not religious differences. And you can see, say, the wars of religion. Modern historians point out it wasn't actually a war between the Protestants and the Catholics. It started like that. But it was made something far more by the French statesmen who turned it into a nationalist affair. So there are others, very, very important differences. In Africa, tribal differences. In some parts of the world, ethnic differences. So there are all sorts of other differences. But if you think religion, and including secular ideology, those profound, all-encompassing worldviews and philosophies of life, are so total in their aspect. In other words, an atheist or a Christian understands who they are, the purpose of life, the nature of reality, the ultimate source of humanity, all that understood within their ideology. So it's the all-encompassing nature of an ideology or religion, the way it includes everything that makes the differences flow from it so profound. And I think there's nothing deeper than religious and ideological differences. But I wasn't just talking religion. Religion's important to say because most of the world is religious. And that's why atheists have got to come to terms with the freedom of conscience for religious people. Now, religious people have to return the compliment. But there are far more religious people in the world of all sorts than there are atheists. So we have to say religious. I would add ideological, including atheism. In other words, there are transcendental worldviews, like the Christian faith, and there are naturalistic worldviews, like atheism.
Thank you. There's a question here about how do we preach civility in the public square to religions that spread through force and conflict as part of their religious teachings.
Mm-hmm. You know the Arab phrase, "you're in our tent." In other words, if you're in the tent of a sheikh, you go along with the dinner manners of the sheikh, sitting on the rug or whatever it is. Now, if you think the essence of the US was it was clear about what it was to be an American. So when people came from Ireland, Italy, wherever they came from all around the world, they were Americanized through the melting pot. And people discussed the melting pot, sometimes a little coercive, but often very profound. And the effects of the melting pot were that it took people who thought in terms of blood, kinship, those sort of ties, thinking now beliefs. This is what unites us. We're Americans, not tied by blood, but tied by beliefs. In Europe, they tended to think of tradition and the past. They came to America, and through the melting pot, they thought of the future and all that they could do, and so on. And you can see the melting pot had very, very profound impact. It was the unum that balanced the pluribus and kept the pluribus creative and not chaotic. Now, the point is today, you're all pluribus in America. You're all diversity with no unity. As one historian puts it, it's relatively easy to become an American, get your naturalization papers, but increasingly difficult to know what it is to be American. And I often say, to CEOs sometimes, church groups sometimes, take a piece of paper, don't do it tonight, but Try it yourself. Take a piece of paper, write down 10 things that are essential to the American unum. In other words, those uniting first principles which are true, whatever religion you come from, whatever ethnic group you're part of, whatever country's language you speak, what is the unum? And many people can't say more than one or two. Whereas in the 19th century, through civic education, Americans were taught what it was to be American. In other words, Muslims come to this country. Now they're talking about replacing the Constitution with a caliphate. They should be taught when they arrive. This is the way we behave in America over religious freedom. These are the ground rules. You're welcome. If you come to enter our tent, this is the way we live. Now, we made a huge mistake in England because we had no melting pot, we had no First Amendment, we had nothing like that. So when the immigration exploded in the 1970s, the French dug into their laïcité and they denied the rights of the Muslims, headscarves and so on. They dug deep in their old ways. The British and the Dutch, we're the two most tolerant nations in Europe, in quotes. And what was the ideology of tolerance in the 1970s? State multiculturalism. You all come. Build your communities. Who cares about our way of life? We're not quite sure what it is even. We bred the bombers who blew up the London Underground. The Dutch bred the people who killed Theo van Gogh and others by their cluelessness. And multiculturalism, that sloppy way, is a disaster. And if America doesn't know what its unum is and what it means to have, you can take millions more immigrants compared with the rest of the world, so long as you make them Americans. Otherwise, as Samuel Huntington says, the day is coming in America, if you lose the unum, where immigration will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution, because you've lost the unum, and you're all pluribus. So you teach them what it is when they come to this tent.
To the mic.
Hello.
I can hear that.
Joshua Gilmore, and I am a graduate student in linguistics. Earlier in your speech, you made vague allusions to how passing of laws leads to people being reticent on matters of the heart. And it seems to me, although you talked about it quite a bit, that you were a little light on actual specifics for what you referred to. And I was wondering if perhaps you might be able to give us an actual example of this, because it seems to me that this is just simply an empirical question.
It's simply what?
It's simply an empirical question. I mean, is it actually true that people are becoming less and less willing to be virtuous because we've been passing laws? In fact, it might actually be the converse. If you pay reference to a lot of the activities that we had in the 1960s, there are people down there that just didn't want to change. Segregation now, segregation today, or segregation then, or in the past. You get the idea. Mm-hmm. Segregation forever.
Just look at the factual status of civic education in the 20th century. After World War I, you had strict quotas and a strong insistence that those who did get in on the strict quotas were subject to civic education. That went on until the mid-1960s, when the strict quotas were thrown out, but so also was the strong insistence on civic education. And now there are not many public schools in America that teach civic education as it used to be understood in terms of the first principles of Americanism. That's the background saying. Now, what I would argue is not that all the legislation drives out civic education, the habits of the heart, but rather people have forgotten the civic education and the habits of the heart, and they put all the eggs in the basket of law. And the problem then becomes the more laws you have, the less freedom you really have. And you can see this not just in religious freedom. Say, most American business leaders are complaining about all the government regulations that come in after scandals, corruptions, and so on. The answer is always more laws. But actually, you need also the teaching of trust and honesty in business leadership at all levels, so you don't have endless laws which cramp freedom. Now, I would say when you have laws, the effect is not that you then discount habits of the heart, but rather people are sort of afraid. I might be sued for doing this, I might whatever, and you get people who jump in and just shut up and keep quiet. Now, there's no question that there are enormous evils in the past, like racism and the importance of the rise of civil rights. I'm not denying any of the blind spots. But there's no question that civic education has by and large disappeared. Private schools, yes, but not in many public schools, and that is fateful. As you know, the public schools were not just founded as free universal education. Go back to Jefferson, Thomas Mann, and so on. They were founded as free universal education that taught the uniting first principles that transcended all the diversity of class and all the diversity of creed. And that was their idea. They had a profound function. I argue with Christians who say, public schools are all a mess. Let's leave them and go to the Christian schools. Well, if you reject the public, I'm not saying you do, but those who reject the public schools need to remember what they were founded for and make sure that something's put in their place that does the job they were founded for, or you'll be in trouble, because nothing's doing what they were designed to do. So that's what I'm arguing.
Thank you.
I have a question. Is it too simplistic to see what is happening now, to say what is happening now in the United States like this? For much of our history, conservative Christians tried to mute secularism through law, and now the tables are being turned.
I think that's a little too simplistic. I'd be much more concerned to say the way that evangelicals, who had in the early 19th century an incredibly constructive view of public life, they were the archetypal reformers, the leaders in charity, the leaders in educational movements. You think of all the colleges founded across America. They were the constructive leaders, but when they stopped thinking, out of fear, say, of German thought, that was fateful. And the evangelicals who no longer think are a disaster to their cause. So it wasn't they tried to mute secularism. No, secularists have their freedom, but we need to discuss with them, debate with them, argue with them, and where the differences are important publicly, to know how to win the arguments. So I'd never use the word mute or muzzle or suppress. No, they have their freedom, and we should be champions of standing for it. We failed.
Russ Lackey.
We'll have just a few more.
Russ Lackey, I'm the campus pastor at Grandview University down the road in Des Moines. A decade ago, I had a chance to have dinner with George Farrell, who I believe taught here at Iowa State. It might be the University of Iowa, I'm not sure. But he did, it was at Iowa State? Iowa, okay. George Farrell, though, spoke about the danger in America over Christians who've lost heart. And what he referred to in what your presentation made me think of is Christians who have lost a vision of God and therefore no longer have a conscience to work in this world, as the prophets of old who saw who God was and then saw a world that was wrong and was forced to speak. And so my question for you is, as you look at public life and you look at Christians in the public sphere, is our conscience a little weak right now? Is it not very strong?
Where I thoroughly agree with you is there are too many Christians with a very impoverished view of their own faith. You read, say, the prophet Isaiah, the great Hebrew prophet Isaiah. You have a soaring vision of God's sovereignty over the nations and the superpowers and all that that means. So, among many points in Isaiah, he's very strong on what became a refrain of Jesus, have no fear. And that's the most repeated statement of the whole Bible from beginning to end, have no fear. And those who know God have no fear. And you look at a lot of Americans today, they're very insecure, very fearful. And a lot of the worst things of the Christian right came out of fear. And we, who are followers of Jesus, should engage with the whole of life with a courage born of trust in the greatness of God and have absolutely no fear. And so, yes, the trust in who God is is extraordinarily critical. And you look, say, I won't mention any names, but you look at the television pastors and so on. The pablum they are preaching in the name of Christ is a disgrace. And I would say, if you look back to the time before the Reformation, the Catholic Church was incredibly corrupt. And if you look at many of the varieties of the Christian church in America now, including evangelical, they are shallow and they are corrupt and they are worldly. And it's not surprising they have no influence in public life. And the sort of pablum they're preaching with these big 30,000 strong churches deserves to have no influence in public life. This country is in deep trouble in terms of its faith in the church. There needs to be a revival, a renewal, and a reformation in the church. We are the problem.
Amen.
What should the Christian response be to gay rights?
Gay rights are a civil right. They are not a human right. A human right is a right that is rooted in what's called inherence. In other words, someone has that right inherently because they're a human being. That is a human right. Gay rights are a civil right in the sense that a particular society has deemed it right to give those rights to the gays in that society. Which means, if you understand that a civil right, like a gay right, should never trump a human right. But in this zero-sum game, again, think of Kai Feldman in the White House, she argues that every time, say, religious freedom contradicts a gay right, religious freedom's got to go. So what she's saying, in effect, is that civil rights now trump human rights, which is to undermine all rights altogether, because what she's really saying, they're all a matter of power. So the now fashionable right, gay rights, which are civil rights, is able to trump the now unfashionable rights, religious freedom, say, of Catholics. That is incredibly foolish. What she's doing, and the gay activists in the extremes, I have friends who are gays who argue for religious freedom for everybody. They're wiser and more responsible. But some of the extremists are now undermining all human rights.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.